for generations. Socialization. History has told us a familiar story. Slavery as a system designed and enforced almost entirely by white men, while white women stood quietly on the sidelines powerless, sheltered, and uninvolved. But what if that story is incomplete? What if some of the most influential actors within the system of slavery were hiding in plain sight, protected by myths of innocence and fragility? White women in the American South were not merely witnesses to slavery. Many were direct participants. They owned enslaved people, inherited them, traded them, and managed their labor. For a significant number of white women, enslaved people were not just property, they were symbols of status, leverage in marriage, and a pathway to authority in a society that otherwise limited women's rights. In a world where political power and legal independence were denied to them, slavery became a tool through which they could exert control. Inside plantation homes, power was not abstract. It was daily, personal, and intimate. Enslaved men and women lived under constant supervision, discipline, and coercion, often directed by the women of the household themselves. From childhood, white girls were taught how to command obedience, how to assert dominance, and how to protect their family's social standing through control of enslaved lives. These lessons were normalized, passed down quietly, and reinforced through generations. This story matters because it challenges comforting narratives. It forces us to confront how deeply slavery was woven into everyday life, family, structures, and social ambition. It reveals that systems of oppression survive not only through open violence, but through tradition, education, and silent acceptance. In this video, we will explore a side of history rarely discussed, grounded in documented evidence, survivor testimonies, dinners, and modern scholarship. If you value honest history and stories that challenge what we think we know, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Let's begin. Behind the image of the obedient Southern wife stood a far more complex reality, one that fits seamlessly into the story we have already begun. While white women lived within a patriarchal system that denied them the vote, restricted their legal identity, and placed them under the authority of husbands or fathers, these limits did not remove them from power. Instead, many learned how to work within the system, bending its rules to secure influence where they could. Slavery became one of the most effective tools through which this quiet power was exercised. Marriage, in theory, erased a woman's legal independence under the doctrine of coverture, merging her identity with that of her husband. Yet in practice, Southern families often treated this law as flexible when wealth was at stake. Enslaved people were frequently transferred to daughters before marriage, listed separately in wills, or protected through legal instruments designed to keep property out of a husband's control. These arrangements were not accidents. They were deliberate strategies, carefully planned to ensure that a woman entered marriage with leverage of her own. In a society where land could be lost and money could vanish, enslaved people were seen as a stable and expandable form of wealth. Within the household, this ownership translated into real authority. A white woman who controlled enslaved labor controlled time, movement, and productivity. Politically, she decided who worked, where they worked, and how discipline was enforced. This authority offered something rare in her world, the ability to command obedience without negotiation. Even as she was expected to submit to her husband in public life, she could rule absolutely within the domestic sphere. Slavery filled the gap left by political and legal exclusion, providing a form of autonomy that felt tangible and immediate. This dynamic also shaped how white women understood freedom itself. For many, independence did not mean equality or shared rights, but dominance over others. Legal petitions, court cases, and private contracts reveal women actively defending their claims to enslaved property, sometimes against their own husbands or male relatives. When financial mismanagement threatened household wealth, some women appealed to courts to separate their estates, arguing that their property, including enslaved people, needed protection. These cases show not helplessness, but strategic awareness and determination. The control did not end with ownership on paper. Daily life reinforced these power structures through routine interactions, punishments, and expectations. Enslaved people experienced authority not only from white men, but from white women who enforced rules, demanded labor, and upheld the household's hierarchy. This reality complicates the traditional image of Southern womanhood as passive or detached from violence. Power was often exercised quietly, behind closed doors, through systems that appeared orderly but rested on coercion. By weaving slavery into their personal security and social identity, white women became invested in its survival. The system offered them stability in an unstable world, status in a rigid hierarchy, and a sense of control otherwise denied to them. Their participation was not incidental, it was structural. Slavery functioned as both an economic resource and a psychological anchor, shaping how they navigated marriage, family, and society. Understanding this connection deepens the story already unfolding. It reveals how oppression adapts, finding new hands to sustain it even within systems that claim to limit those very hands. Slavery did not persist simply because of laws or plantations, but because it was woven into personal ambition, domestic life, and the search for autonomy in a world built on inequality. This system of power did not appear suddenly when a woman married or inherited property. It was carefully taught, practiced, and normalized long before adulthood. From the earliest years of life, white girls in slaveholding households were immersed in an environment where dominance was routine and unquestioned. Slavery was not introduced to them as a moral dilemma or an abstract institution. It was presented as a natural order of the world, something as ordinary as the walls of the house or the fields beyond it. A white girl's childhood unfolded in constant proximity to enslaved people. They dressed her, cleaned her rooms, prepared her food, and responded to her commands. These daily interactions carried silent lessons. She learned that her words carried authority and that obedience was expected. When adults corrected enslaved workers in front of her, when punishments were administered without explanation or remorse, those moments became part of her education. Power was demonstrated, not explained. And repetition turned it into habit. Family played a central role in shaping this understanding. Mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and older female relatives modeled how authority should be exercised within the household. Girls watched closely as women managed domestic labor, issued orders, and enforced discipline, all while maintaining an appearance of refinement and control. The message was clear. Leadership within the home was not only acceptable, it was essential. Mastery over enslaved people was framed as responsibility rather than cruelty, as management rather than domination. As these girls grew older, the lessons became more explicit. They were taught that enslaved people represented wealth, stability, and security. Conversations about inheritance, marriage prospects, and family standing often included references to the number and value of enslaved individuals attached to a household. In this way, slavery became tied to ambition and self-worth. To manage enslaved labor effectively was to prove maturity, competence, and readiness for adult life. This upbringing shaped behavior in subtle but lasting ways. Authority was exercised through tone, posture, and expectation rather than constant force, creating an atmosphere where control felt effortless and justified. Enslaved people were expected to anticipate needs, adapt instantly, and remain invisible unless summoned. For white girls, this reinforced the belief that their comfort and desires were central, while others existed to serve those needs without question. Importantly, these lessons were reinforced by the broader community. Neighboring households mirrored the same structures, and social gatherings quietly affirmed shared values. A girl who demonstrated confidence and control over household labor was praised, while hesitation or softness could be interpreted as weakness. Through approval and imitation, domination became a marker of success rather than a source of shame. By the time these girls reached adulthood, their worldview was already firmly set. The authority they would later wield as wives, mistresses, or property holders felt earned and natural, not learned. Slavery had been woven into their identity, shaping how they understood leadership, responsibility, and entitlement. This continuity ensured that the system reproduced itself not only through laws and economics, but through upbringing and tradition. Seen in this light, the household was not merely a private space but a training ground. Generation after generation, power was passed down quietly, embedded in daily routines and family expectations. The result was a system sustained not just by force, but by education, normalization, and the steady transmission of values that made domination feel ordinary. As these white girls grew into women, the lessons of their childhood transformed into active participation in a system that was as brutal as it was profitable. The knowledge they had absorbed over years of observing discipline and hierarchy became practice, and with it came the authority to shape the lives of those enslaved around them. Their presence in the household was not limited to domestic management. Many moved confidently into the public spaces of commerce, attending markets, negotiating sales, and determining the fate of human lives as routinely as any financial transaction. Slaves were not abstract property, they were laborers, caregivers, and in many cases, the means by which a woman could secure social and economic power. Women orchestrated these arrangements with a careful understanding of both law and custom, knowing exactly how to leverage what society permitted in order to protect and expand their influence. The market for enslaved labor was diverse, and white women were particularly involved in securing wet-nurse black women forced to nurse the children of white families. The demand was high, and the transactions were calculated. These women exercised their authority over the bodies of others in ways that extended beyond ordinary labor management. Enslaved people could be compelled to reproduce, to provide care, or to endure punishments that reinforced the hierarchy, all for the benefit of household comfort, wealth, or status. Daily life under these conditions was controlled by a mixture of subtle intimidation and direct enforcement. Obedience was expected, and failure often resulted in harsh consequences, administered under the very gaze of the women who would inherit both property and social standing. The abuses were not merely incidental or isolated. They were integral to maintaining a household economy built on domination. Historical records reveal cases where enslaved men and women were coerced into bearing children to increase the pool of labor, and where women exercised cruelty in ways that required restraint even from their husbands. Physical punishment, psychological control, and the systematic erosion of autonomy were all part of this carefully maintained structure, turning the household into both a center of social aspiration and a site of relentless oppression. The authority these women wielded was tangible, immediate, and reinforced by every action within the home and in the marketplace. Furthermore, the control extended into the private and intimate spaces of life. Enslaved women were often forced to care for children not their own, to endure the manipulation of reproductive labor, and to perform tasks under conditions that blurred the lines between servitude and survival. These acts were justified under the guise of household necessity, economic planning, or social propriety. Yet the impact on those subjected to such treatment was profound and enduring. For the women in power, these measures were seen as practical and strategic, a continuation of lessons ingrained from early childhood that emphasized order, hierarchy, and mastery over others. In this way, the lives of white women and enslaved people were intertwined within a framework of control that extended from the domestic interior to the broader market. Ownership of labor, manipulation of reproduction, and the calculated exercise of authority allowed women to navigate restrictions imposed by law and society while asserting dominance in very real, material ways. Through these actions, the household became both a training ground for power and a mechanism for sustaining the wider system of oppression. Slavery was not a distant institution or a matter of male politics alone. It was lived daily, enforced and perpetuated through choices made by women who had been carefully taught to see authority as both a right and a responsibility, shaping generations of control and suffering that reverberated far beyond the walls of any single home. When the Civil War ended and emancipation became law, the landscape of power shifted dramatically. Yet for many white women, the end of slavery did not mean the end of control. The authority they had exercised over enslaved people for generations had been a cornerstone of their identity, wealth, and social standing, and its loss was felt not only as a legal change, but as a personal upheaval. These women, trained from childhood to understand hierarchy, property, and dominance, adapted swiftly. finding ways to maintain influence even in a world that had ostensibly stripped them of it. They turned to courts, legal instruments, and local politics, seeking compensation for lost property and fighting to retain as much control as possible over the people who had been enslaved under their households. The concept of freedom was filtered through their own ambitions and anxieties. It was less a matter of justice than of preserving stability, status, and economic advantage. Many white women exploited the transitional period to establish labor arrangements that replicated elements of slavery under new guises: apprenticeship contracts, deeplands, tenancy agreements, and other coerced labor systems emerged as tools to keep formerly enslaved people tethered to households that once owned them. Even when these arrangements provided nominal wages or ostensibly voluntary participation, the power dynamics remained profoundly unequal. Women who had once directed daily labor now leveraged economic pressure and social influence to ensure that those who were legally free remained dependent. In doing so, they blurred the line between freedom and subjugation, ensuring that the familiar patterns of household dominance persisted despite sweeping social change. Beyond the domestic sphere, white women actively supported and benefited from the broader legal frameworks that reinforced racial hierarchy. Black codes, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing systems allowed them to maintain access to labor under the guise of legality, and in many communities, they were among the most vocal proponents of such measures. These laws criminalized basic survival actions for black people and transformed minor offenses into opportunities of forced labor, effectively continuing the exploitation that slavery had once provided. White women who had once supervised enslaved households now extended their reach into civic and legal structures, ensuring that local economies and social norms favored their continued privilege. The post-emancipation period also revealed the ingenuity and persistence with which these women safeguarded their social and financial positions. By negotiating with freed families, influencing contracts, customs and maintaining networks of wealth and influence, they shaped the emerging social order to reflect many of the same hierarchies that had defined their lives during slavery. Their strategies were calculated, adaptive, and deeply informed by generations of inherited practices. The same lessons learned in childhood about authority, obedience, and control were now applied to a world in flux, transforming potential loss into continued dominance, albeit under new forms. In effect, emancipation did not end the influence or the authority of white women. It transformed the methods through which it was expressed. Their roles shifted from direct ownership to systemic manipulation, from the daily supervision of enslaved people to shaping the laws, economies, and social pressures that governed newly freed black communities. The transition from slavery to freedom was neither clean nor complete, and it highlights the ways in which power, once established, seeks continuity. For white women of the post-war South, the end of legal slavery was not the end of opportunity. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter in asserting control, ensuring that the lessons of hierarchy, dominance, and strategic influence continued to shape lives long after the chains were removed. Even after slavery ended and legal bonds were broken, the legacy of control, power, and social hierarchy did not disappear, and neither did the women who had learned to wield it. White women, whose authority had once been exercised within the walls of households and the confines of plantation economies, found new arenas in which to assert influence, shaping society in ways that reinforced the racial hierarchies they had long benefited from. They organized social clubs, charities, and political networks that appeared benign on the surface, but often worked to consolidate power, monitor communities, list indinans, and influence the moral and political life of towns and states. These women understood that dominance could survive without chains if it was embedded in laws, customs, and social expectations. Among the most notorious examples were groups like the Women's Ku Klux Klan, which, while less publicly violent than their male counterparts, wielded influence in ways that were both strategic and pervasive. They participated in shaping schools, social policies, and community standards, using social gatherings, charitable works, and political advocacy to reinforce a worldview in which white Protestant supremacy remained central. By leveraging their social standing, these women could intimidate opponents, support like-minded politicians, and subtly enforce codes of behavior that maintained racial hierarchies long after the formal end of slavery. Their power was exercised not through overt brutality alone, but through the everyday mechanisms of persuasion, influence, and the careful cultivation of networks that ensured their values and the inequalities those values supported were woven into the very fabric of society. This continued involvement highlights a striking continuity. The training, expectations, and lessons absorbed from childhood through adulthood had created a generation of women capable of adapting old structures of control to new circumstances. They translated mastery over household labor into broader social authority, and the same skills that once directed enslaved labor now influenced schools, local governments, and civic organizations. In doing so, they sustained systems of racial oppression, proving that the impact of slavery and hierarchical socialization extended far beyond the legal end of bondage. Understanding this history challenges many assumptions about the past. White women were not simply passive bystanders or secondary actors in a male-dominated world. They were active participants and architects in the maintenance of racial power. Their influence demonstrates that systems of oppression are resilient, evolving to survive political change, and that cultural and social authority can be as powerful as legal or military control in sustaining inequality. It reminds us that the consequences of historical injustice are long-lasting, shaped not only by laws and institutions, but by social norms and the deliberate actions of individuals who understood how to manipulate them to their advantage. Thank you for watching and taking the time to explore this often overlooked perspective in history. If you found this story eye-opening and want to continue uncovering hidden truths about the past, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue to shine a light on history's untold stories. Your support helps bring more research-backed, compelling narratives to light and ensures that these important conversations reach a wider audience.